Since when did being educated become a crime officer? I was just reading a book. Evan Brooks, the black teenager, handcuffed in the middle of Maplewood Park, looked up at the man who had just shoved him into the bench, eyes blazing with anger. The sound of a camera shutter snapped through the air, followed by an explosion on social media as a woman screamed, "Have you all lost every shred of decency? You can't even spare a kid reading a book. His mother is the mayor of this city." The entire park froze. No one could believe what they had just heard. Let's see what happens when that mother finds out and how she deals with this public humiliation. If you saw this happen in real life, would you stay silent or speak up? What state are you in? And does stuff like this happen where you live? That morning, the sky over Maplewood was a rare, flawless blue. Trees cast long shadows across the brick path around the lake. Life was just beginning to stir in soft notes, birdsong, the crunch of bicycle wheels on gravel, the breeze brushing through fresh maple leaves. On a stone bench near the fountain, Evan Brooks, 16 years old, sat quietly, eyes focused on the pages of civil rights and leadership. Jazz played faintly through his earbuds, mingling with the rustling leaves. Sunlight touched his tanned cheek, his face young but oddly calm for someone his age. He read slowly, marking the margins, pausing at times to stare out across the water as if searching for an answer to something larger than a lesson. Not far off, Margaret Lowell passed by with her white-furred dog. She was around 50 with dark blonde hair, a neat coat, and sharp, wary eyes. Seeing Evan sitting still for so long, she stopped and frowned. "That boy's been there for over an hour," she muttered to herself, gripping the leash tighter. The way he kept his head down, silent, avoiding eye contact, it unsettled her, not because of anything he did, but because of a bias buried deep in her own mind. Margaret looked around. No one else paid Evan any attention. A few young mothers chatted near the playground, and kids ran past, yelling. Everything looked normal, but to Margaret, that normalcy became a reason for suspicion. She stepped closer, glanced at the book in Evan's hands, saw a black figure on the cover, and the words "Civil Rights," and grew even more uneasy. One thought echoed in her head. What's someone like him doing here this early in the day? She backed away, pulled out her phone, and with a shaky but firm voice said, 911, I think someone's lurking around the kids in the park. Yes, black, about 16, sitting near the lake. As Margaret described him, Evan turned another page, unaware that her words had just handed him an invisible charge. A charge born from fear and distorted judgment, the kind no court could ever erase. On a bench across from him, another boy overheard part of the call, looked up, and saw the woman pointing at Evan. He frowned, pulled out his phone, sensing something was about to happen. Evan didn't look around, just instinctively removed his earbuds when Margaret's dog started barking, breaking the calm of the morning. He looked up, eyes landing on the woman mid-sentence. He saw her lips moving, her face drawn tight. That look wasn't curiosity or fear. It was something else, something harder to name. It was confusion, maybe, like he was silently asking, "What did I do wrong?" The breeze flipped a page and a few dry leaves fell at his feet. Everything still looked the same, but from that moment on, a fine crack had split through the peace of the park, and nothing could undo it. Evan closed his book, eyes still fixed on the woman speaking to someone on the phone. Margaret caught that look, saw the calm in it, and that very calmness unsettled her. To her, his silence felt like defiance. She turned away but kept glancing back. When Evan bent down to pick up a leaf that had fallen onto his book, Margaret's dog barked louder, tugging at the leash, making her shout, "Back off! I mean it." Evan looked up, his voice quiet but clear. "I didn't do anything. You've been staring at me for 10 minutes. I was reading." The words were gentle like wind, but they only made her angrier. "Reading in the park? Since when do people even do that?" Evan said nothing. His gaze briefly surprised, then softened. In that moment, he thought maybe he should leave, but he didn't know everything had already been set in motion the second Margaret made the call. The sound of a police siren echoed from afar, faint at first, then louder sharp against the still morning. Evan turned and saw two flashing lights reflecting on the surface of the lake. Before he could make sense of it, blue and white shadows were already turning into the path. Margaret stepped back, still holding the leash tightly, her face mixed with worry and relief. For her, it might have felt like safety. For Evan, it was the start of a storm. He stood up, clutching his book eyes, still unsure of what was happening. The sun had climbed higher, its bright light glaring off the lake's surface. And in that moment, in the heart of what seemed like a peaceful morning, the silence was torn open by the wail of a siren, an alarm that marked the beginning of a mistake big enough to wake an entire city. The siren made everyone in the park turn their heads. A few children stopped playing, clutching their mother's hands. Two patrol cars sped in tires, screeching across the mist-damp bricks. The doors slammed open. Officer Travis Cole stepped out first, tall, with the grim face of someone who believed judgment was his right. His eyes scanned the scene, landing on Evan, who stood near the bench gripping his book. Behind him, Officer Brent Hayes moved more slowly, but his half-smile carried something smug. Cole's voice was cold and dry. "Stand up, show me your ID." Evan looked confused for a second, then replied softly, "I'm not old enough for an ID, but I have a student card." Cole glanced at Hayes, letting out a faint scoff like he'd just heard something ridiculous. Hayes raised an eyebrow. "Student card. Around here? Private school, maybe? Or are you lost?" Evan lowered his head slightly, still calm. "I live nearby." That simple reply made Cole sneer. Nearby. He stepped forward, boots hitting the ground with a heavy rhythm that thickened the air. "Where do you go to school? Or are you waiting for your crew?" Evan pressed his lips together, keeping his voice steady. "I was just walking and stopped to read." Cole stopped in front of him, eyes dissecting every reaction. "What are you reading?" Evan said. "Martin Luther King." Cole let out a harsh laugh. "Good. Keep dreaming." A chill ran down Evan's spine. He didn't understand why his answer had triggered such anger. People around them started to turn their heads. A few had their phones out, but no one moved. Margaret stood at a distance, clutching her dog, her face a mix of worry and satisfaction, like everything was going exactly as she'd hoped. Cole signaled Hayes to spread out. He circled Evan slowly, eyes probing. "What are you doing here alone?" "Anyone with you?" Evan replied. "I was just sitting and reading." "In this area?" Cole's voice sharpened. "Do you know where you are?" Evan nodded. "Yes, sir. The park is open to everyone." His answer was barely louder than a breath, but it made Cole furious. He stepped in closer. "Got a slick mouth, huh? Someone called us 'cause you look suspicious and you dare talk back." Evan took half a step back, holding his book tighter. "I'm not talking back. I'm telling the truth." Cole froze, stared hard, then turned to Hayes' note. That defensive attitude. Hayes pulled out his notebook, writing while sneering. "Reads a lot, probably used to preaching." Evan looked up, eyes clear but calm. "I'm just reading history, not preaching to anyone." Cole laughed. "History, huh? Let's see if you make history, kid." His voice was thick with bitter sarcasm. Around them, dog walkers began to steer clear. A few people whispered, and a middle-aged man said quietly to his wife, "He's just a kid." But no one stepped forward. Evan felt the weight of eyes on him as if he were on trial in an invisible court where bias was the only law. He took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice steady. "If you need to see my card, I can show you." Cole held out his hand, his stare still sharp. Evan pulled his student ID from his jacket and handed it over. Cole flipped it back and forth, his tone dry. "Lincoln High. That school's 10 miles from here. What are you doing in this area?" "I took the bus to the library, then came here to read." "Library? At your age, I was playing video games." Hayes chimed in, his laugh cutting through the tense air. Evan said, "I prefer reading." "Prefer reading?" Cole interrupted. "Right. Read enough and started thinking you're smarter than everyone else, huh? Evan shook his head. No, sir. I just want to understand more. Understand what, how to fight the rules that line made. Margaret craned her neck, a satisfied smirk flashing across her lips. Evan didn't respond. He just looked up, and that look made Cole pause. It wasn't fear or pleading, it was clarity. Cole hated that. Hated the silence that carried a trace of resistance. He closed the notebook and tossed the card back. Fine, but you should head home. Don't let us see you here again. Evan bent down to pick up his card, just about to turn away when Cole added, voice sharper. And remember this, don't try to stand out around here. This neighborhood doesn't like that. Evan turned back, eyes steady. If reading makes me stand out, I'm fine with that. That answer froze the air. Hayes let out a mocking laugh. Listen to this kid, thinks he's a preacher or something. Cole narrowed his eyes. Maybe we should check what's in your bag. Evan stepped back, half a pace, gripping his backpack. No need, sir. I just have books and pens. We'll check for ourselves, Cole said, hand already on the bag. In that moment, Evan's palm went cold. He knew he had no choice left but silence. Around them, the crowd started filming. Camera clicks broke the tension. Whispers spread like wind. Someone muttered, he didn't do anything, then looked down and walked away. Cole looked around, saw the phones, and lowered his voice. Put the phones away. This is a routine check. Evan looked up, his voice clear. What routine lets you handcuff someone for reading, officer? That question made Cole freeze for half a second, then he replied, you want answers? Stick around and learn. Evan's eyes darkened. The rustle of leaves reached his ears, and far off a siren echoed like a warning. In that stifling air, something had shifted, slow but unstoppable. From this point on, justice would be weighed against bias, and people would soon learn that one wrong word, one wrong look could turn a peaceful morning into a spark that shook an entire city. The quiet park grew heavy as hurried footsteps echoed across the path. Margaret Lowell rushed in, still gripping the dog's leash, breathing hard. She pointed inches from Evan's face, her voice high and shaken. I told you, he's been watching me and my daughter. The park turned to look. Some people stopped in place, eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and caution. Evan stepped back, trying to keep his voice steady. I wasn't watching anyone. I was just reading. Margaret cut him off, her face flushed. Lying in front of police is arrest-worthy, boy. Officer Cole glanced at Officer Hayes, gave a slight nod, as if they had just been handed the excuse they needed. Cole turned to Margaret, voice calm. You're safe now, ma'am. We've got it handled. Then he faced Evan. His tone so cold the bystanders instinctively stepped back. Sit down. Hands on your knees. Do not move. Evan swallowed hard, trying to keep his breath even. He looked around and saw faces watching him, some sympathetic, some blank. On a bench, further away, Jada Miller, a classmate, had just arrived at the park. She froze at the scene, her hand shaken as she pulled out her phone. The camera lens found Evan where two officers stood just a few steps away. Cole moved forward, his boots hitting the ground in a steady rhythm. His eyes fell on the book left on the bench. He bent down, flipped through a few pages, then tossed it to the ground, his voice pressing out every word. Martin Luther King. What are you reading this for? To learn how to fight us. Evan looked at the book on the ground, his voice quiet but clear. No, to learn how to understand. Cole laughed. Understand what, kid? You think you know anything about justice? Hayes smirked beside him. I bet he wants to be the next black hero. Margaret jumped in, voice shrill. Don't trust a word he says. I saw him looking around like he was waiting for someone. I have a daughter here. I have to protect her. That sentence was a spark dropped on dry grass. Evan turned toward her, his eyes lit with anger. I didn't even see your daughter. I was just sitting and reading. Enough, Cole barked. That's it. No more talking. He motioned to Hayes. Write it down. Define police instructions. Evan clenched his fist, breath growing heavier. I'm not defying anything. I'm telling telling the truth, Cole scoffed. Around here, we define the truth. The wind rustled through the trees, sounding like justice whispering from under pressure. Jada raised her phone higher. The sunlight caught Cole's badge. In the video, his smirk was clear, a smirk of power, of someone who believed he could crush another without consequence. Cole stepped closer, his voice low and tight. Today, we teach this boy a lesson in obedience. The words fell like blades, slicing through whatever lines still separated right from wrong. Evan took a deep breath and looked Cole straight in the eye. There was no fear left, only fury. Obedience, he asked, voice cracking. Because I read a book in the park, Cole didn't answer. He stared at Evan like something that needed to be managed. Margaret whispered beside him, "If you're not doing anything wrong, why be afraid of the police?" Jada tightened her grip on her phone, her heart pounding. She knew she was recording something that mattered, a moment people would remember with anger. "Justice delayed is justice denied." Cole read the quote aloud, then scoffed. "Delayed? Maybe you should start by learning to stay quiet." He dropped the paper and stepped on it as he turned. Evan watched lips pressed tight until they bled. From behind, Hayes murmured, "Hey, Cole, don't overdo it." Cole didn't look back. He needs to understand his place. Margaret nodded, as if finally finding a warped sense of justice. Evan tried to steady his voice. "You don't have the right to humiliate me in front of everyone." Cole raised an eyebrow. "Right? You say that word like you understand it," Evan answered. "I do, because I read." The calm in his voice made Cole's face flush. Let's see what your book says about following orders," he said, then motioned to Hayes, "Cuff him." The sound of metal snapped into the sunlight, heavy and suffocating. The onlookers murmured. Someone whispered, "God, he's just a kid." But no one stepped in. Jada held her phone steady, tears brimming but hands firm. She moved closer, her voice trembling in the recording. "This is Maplewood Park. They're arresting a boy just for reading." Cole caught sight of her. His voice cut through the air. "Turn that off. This is a public space," Jada said. "I have the right to film." He stepped toward her, eyes burning. "Your rights end when I say so." In that moment, Evan turned his head and said quietly but clearly, "Then where is the law here?" The question hung unanswered. Cole paused for a second, then tightened the cuffs around Evan's wrists. The sound hit like a verdict in broad daylight. A gust of wind lifted the trampled page, carried it from the ground, and dropped it by the edge of the lake. In Jada's lens, every detail was captured. The sunlight, the flash of steel on the cuffs, Evan's face, calm to the point of haunting, and Cole's cruel smile. The crowd fell silent. Margaret stood off to the side, holding her dog still, calling out, "I told you people like that are a threat to this neighborhood." Her footsteps faded into the breeze, into the water's soft rhythm. At the center of it all, Evan lifted his head. His eyes darkened in the blinding light. No excuses remained, only the silence of a child turned into a symbol of guilt others invented. And in that silence, Jada knew she had captured the moment that would force the whole city to ask what justice really meant. Maplewood Park grew suffocating, as if the wind had stopped blowing. The sounds of mourning vanished, leaving only the heavy breathing of the crowd and the grind of police boots against the brick path. Evan stood in the middle of it all, throat dry, fists clenched in front of him. He took a deep breath, his voice hoarse from restraint. "I have the right not to be touched if I haven't broken the law." Everyone heard, but no one responded. Cole stepped closer, his stare heavy and unreadable. "People like you don't get to speak here," he said. Voice, low words pushed through clenched teeth. The park held its breath. A few turned away, others covered their mouths, and Jada gripped her phone tighter. In her shaky frame, Evan stood still, his face lit by sunlight, while the two officers cast dark shadows over him. Brent stepped in one hand on Evan's shoulder, the other clamping down on his arm hard. Evan flinched. The sound of skin on skin was faint but sharp enough to cut. Head down. "Let's see what you're hiding," Brent said, then pushed him onto the bench. Civil rights and leadership slipped from Evan's hands and hit the ground cover, flipping open. Wind turned the page's words on human rights stamped under police boots. Margaret stood nearby, face smug. "See, I told you. He brought that propaganda." Brent searched Evan's jacket, pulled out a few notes and a broken pencil, and tossed them to the ground. Cole picked up the book, flipped through it, his expression full of scorn. "Freedom," he said, slowly chewing on each word. "Don't bring that here." His voice cracked the air each syllable like a blade dragged across stone. Evan looked at the book, voice choked. "It's not propaganda. It's a lesson." Cole laughed. "A lesson? You're trying to teach me the law now." He threw the book down. The slap of it hitting the ground echoed in the heat dust rising into the light. Brent gripped Evan's shoulder tighter, forcing him to stay seated. "You act like you know everything, but around here, we say what the law is." Evan turned his head, caught Jada filming from a distance, then looked toward Margaret with her arms crossed. "If the law humiliates the innocent, what's left to respect?" His voice shook but stayed clear. The crowd murmured. More phones were raised. Brent turned face red. "Shut your mouth." His grip tightened until Evan felt it in his bones. Cole bent down and picked up one of Evan's notes. He read a penciled line aloud. "No one is free while others are chained." He scoffed. "Sounds big, but you're in the real world now, kid. Nobody here cares about philosophy," Evan replied. "If everyone thought like that, there'd never be justice." Cole suddenly leaned in his breath, hot on Evan's face, reeking of tobacco and sweat. "Justice is for those who know how to stay quiet. You get that?" Evan stared into his eyes, anger darkening his gaze. "No, justice is for those who know how to stand tall." For a moment, silence grew thick. The words spread like dry thunder across a clear sky. Cole stepped back half a pace, then laughed. "Fine. Stand tall. Let's see how long you last." Brent shoved Evan back down, forced him onto the bench, and went through his backpack. Small items fell to the ground, notebooks, pens, a journal filled with human rights quotes. One paper fluttered and hit Margaret's shoe. She bent down, read the line, "If you are silent about injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor." She threw it back, voice sharp. "Enough. I don't want to hear more of this nonsense." Jada kept filming her lens, shaken, capturing both Margaret's smug face and the cruelty written into Cole's every move. A middle-aged man near the playground spoke up. "Hey, leave the kid alone. He's just a student." Cole turned, eyes cold as steel. "You want to be arrested for interfering with police work?" The man froze, bowed his head, and backed into the crowd. Silence returned thicker than before. Evan looked around and realized no one would step in. He spoke slowly. "You can take my books, but not what I believe." Cole sneered. "What you believe is exactly why you're in trouble. This world doesn't let you believe in fantasies. Maybe not your world, but mine is different." Evan replied, his voice steady. Brent frowned. "He's still talking. Cole, I think it's time we teach him a real lesson." Cole nodded slightly. "Do it." Brent yanked Evan up. The cold cuffs bit into his wrists, the sound of metal crack in the air. Evan breathed deep, tried to stay upright, eyes locked forward. "Trying to be a hero?" Cole asked. "No one's going to remember your name," Evan replied. "I don't need them to. I just need someone to remember what they saw." A gust of wind scattered pages from Evan's journal. Jada followed with her phone, catching the image of a boy forced down the cuffs flashing in the sunlight, and Cole, once again picking up civil rights and leadership, brushing off the dust. He read the author's name, then tossed it down again, voice dripping with disdain. "That's your ideal, a dead dream." Evan stared back. "What you're doing is what kills ideals." Cole narrowed his eyes, lip curling. "Ideals won't save you, kid." The words landed like a hammer, sealing every exit. Far off, Jada kept filming, tears streaming down her cheeks. She knew she was witnessing something that would change many lives, and from that morning on, the phrase "nameless violence" would carry the face of a boy in handcuffs, holding a book in the middle of a park. The click of the cuffs closing echoed through the park like a sharp slap across an already heavy morning. Evan lowered his head. Red marks formed around his wrists, the metal catching the sunlight, drawing every gaze off balance. Cole stood just behind him, hand still gripping his shoulder, while Brent circled eyes scanning the crowd before settling on the strange calm across the boy's face. Evan lifted his head slightly, voice low and clear. "You're proving exactly what this book says," Brent sneered. "Says what? How to resist," Evan answered. "Says what justice means." The reply made Cole pause for a second. Then he tightened his grip. "Justice isn't in books. It's in our hand." Evan stared back, his eyes cutting through the dust of authority, an unshaken look that unsettled and disturbed. Margaret's dog barked, tearing through the air like a soundtrack to the chaos she had helped create. She yanked the leash, shouting non-stop. "That's right. Tie 'em up. You're doing the right thing." People gathered, but kept their distance. A few pulled out phones, filming from behind others' backs, eyes filled with hesitation. No one stepped forward. No one spoke. Wind stirred maple leaves fell, landing between Evan's shoes and the officers' uniforms, a thin line between guilt and innocence, between dignity and violation. Brent laughed loudly, mocking "Philosophy, boy, still feel like lecturing?" Evan took a deep breath, gaze steady. "No need. You're writing the next chapter yourselves." A few whispers broke from the crowd. A woman murmured, "He's so young," and they cuffed him. An old man shook his head. "This isn't right. Not at all." But when Cole turned to look, his stare silenced them instantly. Far off, Jada was still recording. Her screen reflected Evan's face, sweat on his brow, with pressed tight eyes unflinching. In the clip, her voice came out shaky but clear. "They cuffed him just for reading." The sentence floated out like a breath but hit like a verdict. It spread through the crowd like a wake-up call. A boy around 10 clutched his mother's hand and asked softly, "Mom, what did he do wrong?" She said nothing, just pulled him away, though her eyes turned back haunted. Cole looked around and saw every eye now fixed on him. He raised his voice as if to reassert control. "Anyone filming is interfering with police duty." No one replied. Jada kept her phone steady. Her hands trembled, but she didn't stop. Cole saw and marched toward her. "Give it to me." She stepped back. "I have the right to film. This is a public park." Cole's jaw clenched. I said, "Give it." Evan, standing in between, tried to turn, but Brent held him firm. "Don't move," he shouted, voice cracking. "She didn't do anything wrong. Don't touch her." Cole turned back. "Worry about yourself first." He picked up his radio and spoke a few clipped words into it. The static buzzed, then went silent. Evan closed his eyes, trying to steady his breath. In his mind, one line from the book repeated itself again and again. "Silence in the face of wrong is the greatest betrayal of what is right." Jada kept filming. Her lens caught every detail, the sweat dropping from Evan's neck, sunlight glinting off the cuffs, Cole's stone-cold face, and Margaret's dog barking nonstop. The scene turned the park into a public courtroom where a child was stripped of dignity for daring to read. Evan opened his eyes and stared straight into the camera. That look held both fury and belief. He spoke slowly, as if addressing the entire world. "If this is what justice looks like, then we lost our humanity long ago." His voice echoed in the video. When it was uploaded a few hours later, those words became the caption shared millions of times. By nightfall, the footage had spread across platforms from Maplewood to distant cities. No one knew who Evan Brooks was, but they knew he was the boy handcuffed for reading. And from that moment on, his name carried the weight of a truth no one could deny, that human dignity could be stolen in a single morning by cold metal cuffs and the cruel laughter of those who believed they held power. That afternoon, the city of Maplewood baked in the early summer heat, but social media was on fire. The video Jada Miller recorded was posted just before noon and hit over 2 million views within hours. Its title was simple: "Reading While Black." In the frame, Evan Brooks stood handcuffed, sunlight reflecting off the metal on his wrists like a wound, while Jada's voice played behind the camera. They cuffed him just for reading. The clip was just over 2 minutes long with no music, no edits, but every second hit hard. Local news outlets reposted it, then major channels from New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles picked it up. Each share brought a new wave of outrage along with a flood of comments divided down the middle. One side asked, "Why do we need police for a kid? What century are we living in?" The other replied, "There must be more to the story. He probably did something wrong to get cuffed." Debates exploded, followed by hundreds of think pieces, live streams analyzing every frame, every facial expression. A legal expert appeared on TV and said, "If what we see in the clip is accurate, this is a textbook case of abuse of power." A former officer commented, "You can't judge from a clip. We need the full context." But the more they tried to justify it, the angrier people became. The hashtag reading while black flooded every platform. Millions shared Evan's image with the caption, "I read books, not a criminal." Students, teachers, and even principals started posting photos of themselves holding books in front of schools with the same phrase. People who had never spoken on racial issues began to. Each small post became another spark feeding the growing fire. Meanwhile, Margaret Lowell, the woman who called the police, became the target of widespread backlash. Her identity was uncovered within hours. Hundreds showed up outside her house planting signs that read, "Racist, Karen lives here," taping quotes from the video to her front door. Margaret stayed inside, blinds drawn, but the knocking didn't stop. Reporters swarmed, neighbors kept their distance, and her daughter cried in the car after classmates whispered her mother's name during class. A major paper wrote, "Woman calls 911 after seeing black boy reading." The sentence was short enough to spread across America. Margaret, once convinced she was protecting the neighborhood, had become the face of fear, made respectable by skin color. At the same time, the Maplewood Police Department held an emergency press conference. The spokesperson wore a suit and stood behind a wooden podium, voice flat and calm. All actions taken by our officers followed standard protocol. What was meant to ease tensions only sparked more rage. The clip of that sentence, now subtitled and shared everywhere, carried a new caption. "Standard protocol means arresting a child for reading." Beneath every post were thousands of furious comments, questions fired off one after another. What kind of protocol allows a boy to be humiliated in broad daylight? How many protocols have to change before justice exists? Social justice organizers gathered outside City Hall, raising signs chanting Evan Brooks's name. A group of law students launched a petition demanding an internal investigation. Evan remained silent. He didn't appear on camera, didn't speak to the press. At home, he sat by the window looking down at the street where people passed and spoke his name. Jada visited her phone buzzing nonstop with interview requests and broadcast invites, but he only said, "I don't know what to say." Jada's voice trembled. "You don't have to say anything. They already saw it all." He nodded, eyes drifting toward the distance where the last light of day fell across rooftops. He didn't realize that this very silence was pushing the story even further. That night, the national news replayed the video. Viewers across the country watched the image of a boy in handcuffs, not afraid, just deeply disappointed. The anchor closed the segment with one line. "Sometimes the scariest thing isn't the sound of a gun, but the moment a young person realizes their dignity means nothing." The quote was shared hundreds of thousands of times overnight. Somewhere, those who once stayed quiet began to reflect, and those directly involved, though unsure of what would come next, understood one thing: this storm was no longer under control. It was no longer just Maplewood's story. It had become a mirror reflecting an America everyone thought they understood until they saw a boy with a book in hand, cuffed in broad daylight. 3 days after the incident at Maplewood Park, the city was still stunned. Images of the handcuffed boy spread everywhere from coffee shops to school bulletin boards, but the peak of attention came Tuesday evening when officers Travis Cole and Brent Hayes agreed to appear on a live interview for a local television station. On the screen, a blue backdrop read "Safety and Justice," and Cole sat in the center stiff in a neatly pressed uniform. The studio lights reflected sweat on his forehead. The host, a woman with a calm, steady voice, began, "We're here to discuss the video that has shaken the community. Officer Cole, do you have anything to say to the public?" Cole took a deep breath, his voice smooth like a rehearsed line. "No one wants to arrest children, but we have to be preventive." A pause followed. The host tilted her head, slightly locking eyes with him. Preventive of what? Reading. The question sounded soft, but sliced the air like a blade. Cole blinked repeatedly, gaze drifting, then said, "That situation, it looked different in real time. The woman reported someone watching the kids, and we responded by protocol." The host pressed, "And that protocol includes handcuffing a teenager, reading a book." Cole opened his mouth, but no words came. The studio fell silent, broken only by the sound of cameras shifting angles. From the back row, Brent jumped in, speaking faster, with more confidence. "He had an attitude, ma'am. He was uncooperative, answered bluntly, and acted dismissive when we questioned him." The host looked directly at him. "His attitude a crime?" Officer Hayes. Brent lifted his chin to respond, but her voice cut in sharper now. "Or was his crime being born with a skin color that scares people?" Part of the audience clapped, the rest stayed quiet. Cole glanced at Brent, then looked down, hands clasped on his knees. The camera zoomed in on his eyes, heavy with frustration and fatigue, but no sign of regret. The host continued, "I've received hundreds of public questions, and most want to know one thing. Do either of you feel proud of your actions?" Brent forced a smile. "We were just doing our job." "And what job is that? Keeping the area safe by humiliating a child?" Her voice no longer held the neutrality of a reporter. It carried the anger of millions watching. Cole swallowed, trying to stay composed. "You don't understand the full situation. We were placed in a difficult position," the host cut in. "And who was in the difficult position? The boy in cuffs or the ones who cuffed him?" That made Brent snap. He was disrespectful, spoke like he was challenging us. The host gave a cold smile. "If reading a book and answering calmly is seen as a challenge, maybe your department needs to redefine what danger really means." Applause erupted, and both Cole and Brent froze. The studio lights shone down, catching the silver badges on their chests. But this time, the light didn't signal authority, it exposed isolation. The interview ended in a heavy silence. As they left the studio, Cole kept his head down, avoiding the cameras, while Brent forced a smile, his face pale. They didn't know that within minutes, clips from the interview were already spreading across platforms. Online users turned Brent's words into a joke, pairing them with an image of Evan sitting on a park bench, a bold caption reading, "Attitude equals reading to the wrong people." The meme became the most viral image of the week, shared with tens of thousands of mocking comments. One read, "If reading is a crime, America needs more lawyers, not more police." Another said, "Attitude. Maybe they fear intelligence more than crime." The public backlash surged even harder than before. Late-night comedy shows opened with lines like, "Preventive reading the latest modern offense." Online, the clip of the host asking Preventive of what reading was played millions of times. Every dodged glance from Cole, every awkward laugh from Brent, every dead silence in the studio was dissected frame by frame. The conversation moved beyond the incident to a broader discussion about a culture of power that grants people the right to belittle others. And in the middle of that storm, in the quiet corner of a small room, Evan rewatched the interview in silence. He said nothing, just closed his eyes as if listening to the noise of the whole world echoing inside him. Outside the window, the streetlight fell on the open page of a book right at the line. "Nothing is more dangerous than indifference made lawful." 2 days after the police interview, while outrage still burned online, Jada Miller posted a blurry photo on Instagram showing Maplewood Park at sunset. The caption read only 4 words, "I saw it all." The post appeared quietly that evening, but within hours it spread like wildfire. Hundreds commented, thousands shared. Below the caption, Jada added, "I wasn't going to record until I saw the officer smile while handcuffing him." The short sentence, simple as it seemed, ignited a new wave in the debate over humanity. The press jumped in immediately. News outlets quoted Jada's post, highlighting the phrase "the officer smiled" as proof of cruelty. On television, Cole's cold face during the arrest was replayed over and over. A sociology expert commented, "That wasn't a smile. It was the expression of unchecked power the moment a person forgets the line between justice and humiliation." A journalist wrote, "Sometimes a smile costs more than a bullet." The quote was shared thousands of times, paired with the original video setting public reaction ablaze again. Jada began receiving dozens of messages from major outlets. Some asked for interviews, others wanted to buy the video, and some simply sent thanks. She read them all, but answered none. Inside, she felt both relief and fear. She remembered standing behind that tree, watching Cole crouch down and cuff Evan with a smile. That smile made her hands shake so badly she nearly dropped the phone. She had thought about stopping, afraid of being seen, but that moment made her keep going. Now, with the video seen by millions and the entire country talking, Jada wished only one thing: that people had spoken up in the moment while the boy was still tied up in the middle of the park. Online, the support poured in. A well-known author reposted her photo writing. Some people write history with a pen, others record it with a camera. Schools began hosting discussions titled "Reading While Black: The Maplewood Story." Law students, young journalists, and human rights advocates spoke of Jada as a brave witness. But amid the praise came threats. Anonymous accounts messaged her, "You've ruined the honor of the police. You should stay quiet. Agitator." Jada turned off notifications, deleted the app overnight, but her post kept spreading far beyond her control. At the same time, headlines read, "Young Woman Sparks Justice Firestorm." One article in the Chronicle quoted her, "I couldn't stay silent when I saw something wrong. I don't hate anyone. I just want people to know what happened." A photo of her standing outside the park with a sign behind her that read, "Knowledge is not a crime," made the front pages of multiple publications. People called her the witness of a generation, but for Jada, it was simply the consequence of 1 second, the second she chose not to put the phone down. Under the pressure of public outrage, Maplewood split in two. One side demanding justice, the other demanding silence. The police department was forced to place Cole and Hayes on temporary suspension pending an internal investigation. They made no statements, but distant photos showed Cole leaving headquarters, his face ashen, and Hayes avoiding camera's cap pulled low over his eyes. Activists gathered outside City Hall, holding up photos of Evan and banners reading, "Reading is not a threat." The air was heavy, but deep down people felt something new, a sense that this time the truth would not be buried. Through all the noise, one person remained silent: Evan Brooks. He didn't appear on TV, didn't post, didn't speak in public. Reporters waited outside his home, microphones raised, asking his mother how she felt, but she only said, "My son has nothing to prove. That boy did nothing wrong." Evan sat in his room, staring out the window, where the afternoon sun hit the leaves on the porch. On the desk, Civil Rights and Leadership lay open to the last page, where his handwritten note still read, "Silence can become the language of resistance." He didn't know that his silence was now speaking for him across the world. Forums, newspapers, and social media tried to explain why he wouldn't speak. Some believed he was waiting for justice. Others said he was showing how dignity can stand tall without shouting. Under every post were thousands of comments. Evan Brooks doesn't need to speak, we're speaking for him. A boy silent in a noisy world that's the loudest message of all. At the same time, Jada's video was clipped by major networks, slowing the frame of Cole's smile against Evan's calm stare. When aired, the anchor said, "If anyone asks what justice looks like, this is the answer, a silent boy and a smile that should never have existed." The line echoed like the final bell of the storm. In the quiet corner of his room, Evan shut off the screen, gently placed his hand on the book, and let out a soft breath. He didn't know what waited ahead, only that from that moment on, his silence had become the spark forcing a nation to look at itself. In the large room at City Hall, the screen's glow lit the face of Mayor Adrian Brooks. She sat still, hands clasped on the table, eyes locked on the clip playing before her. The speaker echoed every detail: metallic cuffs, a shaky voice behind the camera, the image of a boy pinned to a park bench. No one in the room dared to breathe. A young aide standing behind her stammered, "Madam Mayor, that's..." Adrian cut in, voice low and steady. "I know, that's my son." The sentence dropped the room into complete silence. Only the second hand of the clock tapped forward, each click cold and suffocating. Adrian leaned slightly back in her chair, eyes still fixed on the screen where Evan, her son, looked up surrounded by police. That face, that gaze, she recognized instantly. It was the same gaze that once asked her mom, "What is justice?" when he was little. Her throat tightened, but her expression held firm, the calm of a politician used to facing crisis. She turned off the video. The room dimmed, leaving only the desk lamp's faint glow. Another aide spoke cautiously. "Should we handle the media first?" Adrian turned, her voice calm but carrying in the weight of a storm. "The media isn't the problem. The problem is what made a boy treated like a criminal just for reading a book." She stood and walked toward the window, looking down at the plaza where dozens were gathered holding signs with Evan's name. From above, she saw the banner, "Reading is not a threat," glowing in the evening light. Her breath grew deeper, heavier. Her shoulders trembled slightly, then stilled. An aide approached, whispering, "We can prepare a statement." Adrienne turned back, her voice slow and sharp. "I don't need a statement. I need to see them." Everyone in the room knew exactly who them meant. She closed her laptop, eyes firm. "Get the car. Right now." The hallways of City Hall echoed with the sound of her heels, each step like a drumbeat. Outside, people waiting recognized her. Some nodded, others lifted phones to record. Adrienne said nothing, her eyes fixed far ahead where the sunset burned the sky red. Inside, she carried both a mother's pain and a leader's quiet rage. Not rage because her son was mistreated, but because she knew what stood behind it was a system rotting from within. As she stepped down the stairs, she stopped, stared straight into a reporter's camera, her eyes hard as steel. "I'm gonna see them," she said plainly, then got into the car door, closing behind her with the engine's roar. The car raced through Maplewood streets, streetlights flickering on as they passed. Adrienne sat in the back, hands clenched, gaze low, like someone mapping every next move. In her mind flashed images of her son running through her office as a child, reading in the corner, and now cuffed in the park under hundreds of watching eyes. Her heart ached, but not a single muscle in her face moved. Outside the window, the outline of the police building came into view. She whispered almost to herself, "If justice has lost its way, then today it will be pulled back." And in that moment, the woman known as Mayor was no longer a politician handling a crisis, but a mother walking into battle to reclaim her son's dignity and the soul of a city that had forgotten what justice really meant. Adrienne closed her laptop, the metallic snap cutting through the thick air of the conference room. Her gaze was cold like winter lake water. No emotion showed, but everyone could feel that what was about to happen would not be just another press event. "Get the car," she said quietly, voice low but final. An aide rushed out. The rest exchanged glances, no one daring to speak. "I don't need a statement," she continued. "I need to meet them." The words "meet them" landed like a summons carrying the weight of power fused with restrained fury. The glass wall behind her reflected the image of her rising posture upright, the stride of someone too familiar with political storms. The lights overhead glinted off the polished floor in scattered strips, and between them Adrian moved slowly, each step measuring a world that had just cracked open inside her. Every footfall echoed on the marble floor, sounding like the hammer in a courtroom warning that judgment was near. The secretary hurried to keep pace, notebook in hand, but Adrienne didn't turn. She said only, "Contact the police chief. Tell him I want him waiting in his office. This conversation will happen face to face, not filtered." As she stepped out into the hallway, the staff paused mid-meeting, falling silent. They recognized the look, not angry, not loud, but something that made people lower their eyes. Sunlight streamed through the window, brushing the silver in her dark hair, tracing the lines of a face carved by both authority and cost. On the wall, portraits of former mayors stretched in a row, silent witnesses to the city's legacy, but none had faced what she now carried. Adrienne passed by her shadow, long on the glass wall, the silhouette of a mother shouldering both duty and personal grief. Each echoing step marked a warning for those who had touched the final boundary of justice. When the elevator doors opened, Adrienne stepped in the ceiling lights, casting down on her face, where calm and resolve quietly converged. In that moment, she was no longer a mayor handling a political crisis, but a woman walking into a battle for her son, for the dignity she believed the entire city owed. The glass wall outside reflected her figure, fading into the soft yellow light of the hallway like a verdict being signed before anyone had the chance to read it. Those left behind in the room said nothing to one another, but all understood every step Adrienne Brooks took now carried the weight of a summons, and once she arrived, no excuse would hold. That afternoon, the air around the Maplewood Police Department was thick like a storm about to break. Dozens of reporters crowded the gate microphones, raised cameras pointed at the main entrance. Protest signs and justice banners lined both sidewalks, voices shouting over the sounds of sirens and crackling radios. From a distance, a black car slowed at the steps. An aide rushed to open the door, and out stepped Evan Brooks, his eyes tired yet calm and alert. Two officers flanked him, escorting him inside for clarification, as the department's statement had said. Under the flashing lights, the boy once handcuffed in the park was now a living symbol of a national debate. Every camera followed his steps. No one spoke, but the silence was louder than the chants outside. Inside the hallway was stark and white people moving fast, tension visible in every face. A cop, waiting at the end of the hall, whispered to a colleague, "Whose kid is that making the whole city lose its mind?" No one answered, only the knowledge that a special guest was on the way. At that moment, the main doors swung open, wind scattering papers across the reception desk. Adrienne Brooks entered, dressed in a simple black suit. Her walk was steady, her gaze cold and sharp. At first, no one noticed her amid the rush of staff and reporters, until a desk officer looked up, froze, and stammered, "Madame Mayor." The sound traveled like an invisible signal. Everyone turned, flashbulbs erupted, and cameras stretched for each frame. Adrienne stopped in the center of the lobby. Her face composed the light in her eyes, making her look both commanding and distant. No one greeted her. No one dared approach. She walked to the front desk and said clearly, "I need to see the man who arrested my son." Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried, and the entire room shifted. A young officer lowered his head quickly, signaling someone to notify command. Outside, seeing the moment unfold, reporters surged forward, lenses locking on what looked and felt like a historic second. On the second floor, Officer Travis Cole was in a meeting with the department chief. When told the mayor had arrived, he froze, sweat rising along his spine. He looked over the railing and saw Adrienne climbing the stairs, her small frame cutting through the crowd like pressure through steel. People stepped aside without being told. Cole leaned toward Brent Hayes and muttered, "She's really here." Brent replied softly, "What do we even say?" Cole tightened his cap, his face darkening. "Tell the truth or say nothing." The meeting room doors opened. Adrian entered, her steps sharp and unshaken, and there was no mistaking it now. A mother wronged, and the head of the city had stepped directly into the heart of the system she was meant to lead. The police chief stood up abruptly, his voice unsteady. "Madam Mayor, we—" Adrian raised her hand, cutting him off. "No explanations," she said, eyes locked on Cole and Hayes. "I just want to look directly at the men who made my son kneel in the middle of a public park." Cole swallowed hard. "Ma'am, it was a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding," Adrian interrupted, her voice steady, each word sharp as a blade. "I watched the video. I heard you laugh while handcuffing a child, and now you call that a misunderstanding?" The room fell silent. Only the faint hum of cameras outside filtered through the thick glass. Brent stared down at the table, his hand clenched white. Adrian walked slowly around the table, her eyes sweeping over everyone. "I'm not here to ask for special treatment for my son. I'm here to ask, if it weren't my child, if it were any other kid, would you have acted differently?" No one answered. The question cut through the silence like a drill, exposing everything buried beneath. Outside the window, late sunlight hit her hair, casting a thin halo. That light spilled onto the table, illuminating the trembling hands of the men across from her. Adrienne stood tall, her voice low but firm. "From today forward, Maplewood will no longer stay silent in the face of wrong, and you better be ready with answers, because justice starts in this room." When she finished, it was as if the entire station stopped breathing. Her eyes met the camera recording through the glass, calm as if she knew the world was listening. Downstairs, Evan looked up through the security gate and caught his mother's gaze from the balcony. In that moment between cameras and noise, a different kind of silence rose, the silence of trust being restored. Brent froze, his face twitching as if searching for a defense, while Cole went pale, his eyes unfocused. They hadn't expected the mayor to appear like this. No appointment, no announcement, and no press team. The room stayed heavy with silence, broken only by the sunlight streaking across the floor. Adrienne stood before them. No raised voice, no dramatic gestures, but her words carried a weight that stopped everyone cold. "Is this how my city treats its children?" she asked slowly, each syllable landing like a verdict, her gaze fixed on the two men across from her. That question hung in the air, part accusation, part mirror, reflecting the entire system they represented. No one answered. Brent looked down at his hands, his index finger lightly scratching the surface of the table, his shoulders hunched. Cole tried to stand tall, but sweat traced a line down his temple, his eyes darting toward the chief like searching for cover. The chief opened his mouth, but Adrian turned her head and her gaze stopped him. She continued, voice steady and low, "You are officers of this city, paid by taxpayer money, entrusted with power to protect, yet you use that power to humiliate a child." She paused, eyes fixed on them. "I wanted to hear it directly. Whose orders were you following?" Brent swallowed, his voice barely above a whisper. "We responded to a citizen's call, thought he was watching kids." Adrienne cut in. "And your first move was to handcuff a boy reading a book." The camera outside was still rolling, its red light blinking steadily like the heartbeat of a tense room. A few reporters leaned closer to the glass lenses, focused on Adrienne. Light hit half her face, the other half sunk in shadow, a stark contrast between power and fury. "I watched the video," she said, "and I heard your laugh, Officer Cole. While you laughed, that boy looked straight at you, not afraid." "Do you know why?" Cole clenched his hands, his voice rough. "Ma'am, I didn't mean, because that boy was raised to believe the law protects people," she continued. "And that day, you broke that belief." The entire room fell silent. Even the the wind at the window seemed to hold its breath. Adrienne walked slowly around the table, her heels tapping a steady rhythm, her voice dropping but cutting sharper. "When you touched my son, you touched this whole city. Not because he is the mayor's son, but because he is part of a generation that still believes justice exists." She stopped, turned to face them. "And today I am here to say that belief will not be buried." Outside, reporters pressed against the glass, catching the slight smile on her lips, the kind of smile that tells you anger has turned into resolve. The chief loosened his tie, trying to ease the tension, but Adrienne raised a hand. "I will be requesting an independent investigation," she said, "and I want every report on my desk before sundown." She looked back at Cole, her eyes no longer cold, but steady. "If you think this is retaliation, you're wrong. I want this corrected so no other child ever goes through the same." Her words echoed in the quiet, settling into the pale gray walls of the station like a verdict already written. Then Adrienne stepped back, inhaled deeply, and turned her gaze to the window where the city was fading into gold. The sunlight stretched across the floor, casting long shadows from her black shoes, making her silhouette look as if it were melting into the light. No one in the room dared to speak. The entire structure of power bowed in silence before a mother standing at the crossroads of justice and love. Her final question lingered in the air, making everyone feel smaller beneath its weight. "Is this how my city protects its children?" And outside, through the thick glass, the cameras kept rolling, capturing a moment Maplewood would remember for a long time. Right after the confrontation at police headquarters, Mayor Adrienne Brooks called an emergency meeting in the central chamber of City Hall. News of it spread faster than any official order. When she walked in, every official and agency head was already seated, the tension so thick that everyone sat upright, bracing for a political storm. Adrienne brought no prepared remarks, just placed a thin folder on the table, scanned the room, and said plainly, "I don't want badges suspended. I want this system exposed." The words echoed in the closed room, and every breath seemed to pause. She didn't yell, didn't rage, but her voice carried the weight of someone who knew exactly where the rot began. The police chief, once confident behind microphones, now sat with his head lowered, hands laced tightly. "Ma'am, we've launched an internal investigation and the officers involved are temporarily suspended." Adrienne responded immediately, "I don't care about suspensions. When the system is broken, swapping out faces is just putting on a new mask. I want to know how this could happen without anyone noticing." She paused, her gaze turning cold. "And I want to know how much longer people will hesitate to call injustice by its name." Heads bowed, some shuffled their files just to avoid her stare. The doors swung open, and officers Travis Cole and Brent Hayes were led in. The harsh white light of the room washed them pale, exhausted. Cole stood silent, hands clasped in front, his voice fading. "We didn't know he was your son." Adrienne stared directly, unblinking. And if he were someone else's son, what would have changed? Cole didn't answer, eyes falling like a man stripped of every excuse. For a few seconds, the room was still broken only by a pen tapping softly on wood and the ticking of a distant clock. A legal advisor on the left cleared his throat, about to mention a procedural lapse, but Adrienne raised her hand, her tone sharper. "This is no longer about procedure. This is about ethics." She turned to the chief. "If you still think this was an isolated incident, then you don't understand the problem. What makes me furious isn't that Evan is my son. It's that if I weren't in this position, that boy might already be buried in some nameless report." The room held its breath, no one lifting their head. Brent spoke softly, voice trembling. "We acted, thinking it was our duty." Adrienne nodded slightly. "I know, but duty can't come before humanity." She exhaled, her voice dropping lower but turning colder. "Starting today, I want every officer in this department to undergo a full review on conduct policy on human rights and on how they see the community." Light filtered through the glass, revealing the exhaustion but resolve in her eyes. "This is no longer longer about one family. She said, "This is about a city, a culture, and a test of whether we have the courage to make it right." Her words landed like heavy stones, and no one responded. When Adrienne stood, the leather chair scraped lightly against the floor, yet the sound rang out like a bell, marking the end of an era of silence. Her question rang clear. And if it were someone else's child, what would be different? Each word fell on the meeting table like a blade slicing through layers of excuse. Her voice was not loud, but strong enough to make everyone lower their heads. The question wasn't aimed at one person, but was a reckoning directed at an entire system hiding truth beneath polished language. No one answered. Cole looked down his throat tight. Brent clenched his hands. The chief of police pressed his lips together as sweat beaded on his temple. In that moment, Adrienne knew they couldn't answer because any defense would only confirm guilt. She stood tall, her face calm, but eyes burning, the window light catching her gaze, making her eyes shine in the sterile white of the conference room. A local news reporter seated at the end of the table, one of the few granted permission to record, realized the weight of that moment. Adrienne's question aired in the evening news just a few seconds long, but it spread across the country like fire through dry woods. On national television, the image of her standing in the meeting room, voice, firm eyes steady, replayed over and over. Below the banner read, "Maplewood Mayor. If it were someone else's child, what would be different?" The question became the center of every debate, not just in politics, but in everyday life. Commentary shows brought on by lawyers, professors, and activists, each offering their own take, but all agreeing it had struck the deepest nerve in society, the kind of inequality that hides behind routine and bias. A veteran journalist wrote, "That question wasn't meant to be answered. It was meant to force every American to confront their own silence." On social media, millions shared the short video. In the comments, people wrote, "If it were my child, would it be different? If it were your child, would anyone dare put them in cuffs?" The question spread beyond Maplewood, becoming a symbol of a new wave for justice. On college campuses, students held forums on equality and civic duty, playing the clip, then sitting quietly for minutes afterward. Many older citizens, once in public service, admitted the word stung. A retired judge said on live TV, "I've presided over hundreds of trials and no one ever asked me that." Maybe because they feared the answer. Adrienne hadn't expected her question to reach beyond that small room. She only meant to speak what everyone else avoided. But when she saw the news replayed, she understood that sometimes the right question at the right moment carries more power than any command. That evening, she stood by the window of the city hall, looking down at the square where hundreds had gathered, holding signs with her exact words. The yellow glow of the streetlights lit up the faces of the protesters, showing a mix of anger and hope. She whispered to herself, if one question can make them reflect, maybe justice still has a chance. And somewhere across the city, Evan sat by his own window, the screen's light reflecting on his face as he heard his mother's voice echo across the nation, a voice that had made millions stop and wake up. After the video and Mayor Adrienne's question spread across the country, public pressure forced the city of Maplewood to launch a full internal investigation. By the next morning, major newspapers ran the same headline, "Who's really being protected in this city?" The investigation quickly unearthed files long buried in drawers, old complaints, hidden accusations, all naming Officer Travis Cole and Officer Brent Hayes. One report noted Cole had been flagged for hostile attitude toward minorities. Another showed Hayes had stopped more than 20 black teens in a single month without clear cause. All were previously dismissed as lack of evidence and closed. But this time, under the glare of media attention, everything was pulled into the light. Every word in those files becoming proof of a system asleep at the wheel of its own power. In an emergency press conference, a local representative stood before cameras and demanded the city reevaluate the entire stop and check procedure. A policy allowing police to stop citizens without a specific reason. We gave them power, and they used it to spread fear," he said, his voice filled with anger. The words rang out over cheers from the public, while inside government offices unease spread. Phones rang nonstop, closed-door meetings stacked up, but the more officials tried to calm the outrage, the more scrutiny they faced. Journalists uncovered that Stop and Check had been flagged by human rights groups for years, but past administrations ignored it, citing public order as justification. Adrienne sat in her office reading through every page of the reports sent in. Her eyes paused on the list of overlooked cases, a mix of disappointment and resolve rising in her chest. She knew Evan's case was just the surface, and what needed to be done wasn't about disciplining 2 officers, but cutting out the root of the disease that had made this city numb to injustice. When her aide asked if they should call a press conference, Adrienne answered quietly, "Let the truth speak." Her voice was calm, but her eyes held a fire that couldn't be put out with apologies or bland administrative statements. On news channels, footage showed hundreds gathered outside City Hall, holding signs reading "End Stop and Check, Reform the System." Their chants echoed down the streets, mixing with car horns, creating a sound both chaotic and powerful. A high school girl spoke at the protest, voice shaken but firm. "If Evan Brooks hadn't been arrested, we might still believe everything was fine." That line was clipped and aired everywhere, becoming a wake-up call for a younger generation. Meanwhile, Cole sat in the interrogation room, eyes sunken, his face showing clear exhaustion. He knew this time there was no way out. Outside the door, reporters still waited, pens in hand, ready to write down every word, every detail. In another corner of the city, Evan turned on the TV and saw protesters holding signs printed with his mother's word. He smiled slightly, not out of victory, but because finally someone had dared to face the shadow Maplewood had long been afraid to confront. The next morning, Maplewood City Hall was packed. Hundreds of reporters crowded the steps, cameras lined in rows, and the lights reflecting off the white stone wall made the building look like a stage for justice. At 9 o'clock sharp, the main doors opened, and Mayor Adrienne Brooks stepped out in a simple dark suit, carrying nothing but a folder. Behind her stood Evan Brooks, her son, face calm, eyes steady. The square fell silent. Adrienne walked up to the podium, the microphone humming softly. She set down the folder and looked straight at the crowd. Her voice was low and firm. "I know why you're all here. You've seen the video, you've heard my question. But today I want to talk about something more important, action." She paused, her eyes lit by flashing lights. Justice doesn't come from title, it comes from action. The room fell silent, with only the sound of cameras capturing each breath. Adrienne continued. "Titles may make people bow, but only actions make them change. A just city cannot exist if we rely only on titles or power. It has to begin with every officer, every citizen, every person hearing me today." Each word hit like a drumbeat, cutting through the heavy morning air, steady and strong. Reporters wrote non-stop, while the crowd below grew still, then slowly broke into scattered applause. Adrienne held up the report in her hand, listing the reforms she was demanding, reviewing the stop and check policy, creating an independent oversight board, and launching mandatory racial bias training for all law enforcement. "If we truly want change," she said, "then we must begin with honesty. No one gets to stay silent when justice is violated." Behind the podium, Evan stood still, hands loosely clasped in front of him. Wind from the Maple River passed through, gently moving his hair, sunlight casting across his face like a living statue. Evan didn't speak, didn't look around, but his presence alone was enough to quiet the entire crowd. In the rapid sweep of camera lenses, the boy, once handcuffed, now stood behind the city's leader, not as a victim, but as a symbol of a reclaimed belief. His eyes were calm, but deep inside them was the resolve of someone who had learned that justice does not exist on its own. It must be protected every single day. A reporter called out, "Do you think your son will forgive those who hurt him?" Adrienne turned to look at Evan, then faced the microphone. "He doesn't need to forgive because he never held hatred. What I see in my son is not anger but belief, and that is exactly what this system has lost." The crowd responded with louder applause. Some stood up and others shed tears. Evan bowed his head slightly in response, and in that moment, among a sea of cameras, he was no longer the boy labeled a suspect, but the face of a new generation demanding justice that lives up to its name. When the press conference ended, Adrienne stepped down the stairs gently, taking her son's hand. The two walked through the crowd of reporters and cheering citizens, her posture still firm, Evan walking slowly, his gaze at peace. From afar, a journalist whispered to a colleague, "That boy made an entire system bow without saying a word." In the midday light, as their figures faded into the square, something in the city shifted, subtle but unmistakable, like the first breath of something that might truly be called justice. 3 days after Mayor Adrian Brooks's press conference before Maplewood had time to settle, another wave erupted. Early that morning, the state's largest news channel aired a leaked recording from within the police department. Through the crackle of a radio, Officer Travis Cole's voice came through hoarse and weary. "I'm tired of black kids flaunting their words." That line, brief, cold, and soaked in bias, hit the city like a spark on dry hay. Within minutes, the recording spread across every social platform. News stations looped the quote alongside footage of Evan in handcuffs and Adrian's speech. People listened, then fell silent, not from shock, but because they knew exactly what they were hearing, the exposed core of a power that had thrived in the dark too long. On the streets, outrage surged. New signs were raised. Words are weapons. Citizens gathered outside the police station chanting for the immediate firing of Cole and Hayes. Those who once defended them quietly deleted old posts, and those who had doubted Evan now bowed their head. A mother stood in front of the station holding her child, her voice shaken but firm. "If he's tired of black kids who can read, then we'll read louder." That line was recorded, spread online, and became the rallying cry of a new movement. A movement born not from politics but from ordinary people who had endured quiet disrespect for far too long. Inside the mayor's office, Adrienne listened to the recording through headphones, eyes closed. When the static faded, she removed them, lifted her head, and looked at her advisors. "This is no longer a personal issue," she said, her voice low but full of strength. "This is the true voice of a system that has forgotten humanity." Her chief advisor suggested an emergency press conference, but Adrienne shook her head. "Oh, this time I won't speak. I want them to hear themselves." And indeed, the force began to divide. A group of younger officers publicly issued a letter of apology to the community, while others stayed silent or defended it as just a tired remark. But no one believed those defenses anymore. In the holding room, Cole watched the news on a small screen. Each time his voice echoed from the speakers, his throat tightened. Words once spoken casually on a weary day had now become the verdict on his entire career. Brent sat across from him, not looking up, only saying quietly, "They're burning your likeness out there." Cole gave a weak chuckle. "I used to think I kept order." Then he said nothing more. In that moment, the man who had once believed in his badge finally understood what cost him everything. Wasn't a single mistake, but his belief in the right to offend without consequence. At the same time, in the central square, thousands gathered in the rain, replaying the leaked recording through loudspeakers. Cole's voice echoed through the damp air, then was drowned out by a collective chant. "We are tired of your hate." The square lit up with phone screens, each person holding a sign with a quote from Civil Rights and Leadership, the very book Cole had once thrown to the ground. In the crowd, Evan stood quietly unrecognized. He looked up at the sky, feeling each drop on his face, gripping the soaked book tightly in his hands. Amid the rain, his mother's voice echoed in his mind, "Justice doesn't come from titles, but from action." And now it was the actions of ordinary people right in the next line of what she once said, "Justice begins when silence ends." As the media storm raged on, the name Margaret Lowell resurfaced across headlines. She was summoned to the police department to explain her false report. That morning, Maplewood was shrouded in fog, and reporters waited early at the gate. When Margaret stepped out of the car, her face was pale, her eyes blank. Gone was the smug woman who screamed into the phone or smirked as Evan was handcuffed. She walked through the crowd in silence, clutching her bag tightly, head down, steps unsteady. Questions flew around her. Do you regret it? What did you think of the recording? Do you still believe you were right? Margaret gave no answers, lips pressed tight, eyes distant. Perhaps for the first time in her life, she was facing the consequences of a fear she created herself. Inside the station, when asked why she called the police, she spoke softly. "I was scared. I thought he was following me." One investigator looked directly at her and asked, "What did the boy do to make you afraid?" Margaret fell silent, lifted her head, then lowered it again. There was no answer that could excuse a fear rooted in skin color. The questioning continued in near silence, broken only by the scratch of a pen signing reports and the occasional sigh. As she stepped outside, dozens of cameras turned to her, but Margaret did not flee. She paused for a few seconds, looked straight at them, eyes tired, and said slowly, "I was wrong. I didn't know my fear could nearly destroy someone's future." Then she turned and walked away, the figure of a woman who once embodied bias, now fading like a shadow in the gray fog. Online commentary about her spread quickly. Half were furious, the other half quietly reflective. People started speaking less about Evan and more about themselves, how they react to others, the small prejudices they never noticed. What began as an isolated act of discrimination shifted. Scholars, journalists, and even members of law enforcement began calling it an ethical reckoning, not just for the police, but for society as a whole. Police academies across the state organized forums titled Fear and Bias. In these sessions, young officers were asked to review the entire Maplewood case, listen to the leaked recording, reread Margaret's call transcript, then write their reflections. Many admitted to realizing a bitter truth bias does not only come from bad people, but from ordinary ones who believe they are doing the right thing. Evan's story was no longer just about justice. It had moved into deeper territory, professional ethics and the fragile line between protection and control. On an evening news program, the anchor said, "This case didn't just expose the truth about two officers, it held up a mirror to all of us." And that was true. Maplewood was no longer the center of a scandal, but a reflection of the painful truth about a society learning again how to see each other as human. The hearing was held at Maplewood's Central Hall, a building usually reserved for administrative meetings, now packed to capacity. Outside, lines of residents had waited since early morning, many holding signs that read, "Justice begins with truth." At exactly 10 o'clock, the two large doors swung open. Officer Travis Cole and Officer Brent Hayes entered into a storm of clicking cameras. They wore uniforms, but their badges had been removed, leaving faded outlines on their chests. The two sat down, facing a long row of ethics committee members and dozens of TV lenses aimed directly at them. The broadcast lights were blinding, exposing even the smallest expressions on their faces. A national news reporter whispered to a colleague, "They're standing before the court of public opinion, not the court of law." And it was true. The entire country was watching Maplewood. Other cities aired the hearing on public screens, and schools paused classes to discuss the case. When the presiding officer called for silence, the room held its breath. The clerk began reading a letter from Mayor Adrienne Brooks. She was not present, but her words echoed clearly through the microphone. "I do not ask for revenge. I ask for accountability." Each word cut through the air like a blade, cold and precise. A city only deserves to be called civilized when those who enforce the law are also judged by it. Cole kept his head down, eyes sunken, hands tightly clasped. Brent sat beside him, shoulders trembling, his face pale. The chair asked, "Do either of you have anything to say before the committee delivers its decision?" Cole looked up, his voice raspy. "I've served for 19 years and never thought I'd be here. I won't make excuses, but I forgot that power does not give anyone the right to belittle others." He paused, inhaled. "I was wrong, not for breaking protocol, but for forgetting why I wore the badge." His words made several in the audience lower their heads, some wiping tears. Brent followed, voice soft but clear. "I was wrong for staying silent when my partner was wrong. I thought silence was loyalty, but now I see it was complicity." Outside, hundreds watched on a giant screen. When that part played, applause broke out not for forgiveness, but because the truth had finally been spoken. In the hall, a committee member asked, "Do you understand that the consequences of your actions go beyond individual misconduct?" Cole nodded, eyes filled with tears. "I do, because it made a child lose faith in the justice we swore to uphold." The chair nodded and read the conclusion. "The committee hereby strips both officers of their badges and forwards the case to the Criminal Investigation Unit." When the verdict was announced, no one applauded, no one cheered. The entire room fell into silence. That silence carried more weight than any sentence, because it came from the understanding that every mistake carries a cost, and the cost of disregarding human dignity is the permanent loss of honor. Brent rose from his seat and walked slowly, his heavy shoes striking the tile floor, while Cole paused for a few seconds before the cameras. His eyes looked straight into the lens, and he calmly said, "If anyone out there is listening, remember, justice doesn't need defending, it just needs to be done." That image spread across evening newscasts, two men walking out of the chamber under the harsh white lights behind them, Adrienne's letter being read again and again on live broadcasts. On that late evening, Maplewood fell quiet, and for the first time in many years people felt the breath of truth, slow but returning. The lights in the hearing room still shone on the testimony table as the chair asked the two officers for a final statement before the committee reached its decision. Hundreds of eyes turned toward them, the air thick as if the entire room was holding a single breath. Officer Brent Hayes bowed his head deeply, his voice hoarse with restraint. "I was wrong." The words were simple, but they rang out clear in the stillness. In that moment, pens stopped moving, reporters stopped typing, and everyone saw in that man the collapse of a belief once thought unshakable. He said nothing more, just sat still, hands trembling slightly on his knees as if trying to hold on to the last fragments of dignity. Cole sat beside him, his face gaunt, eyes hollow, as if carrying a lifetime of weariness. He looked up straight at the camera, pointed at him, eyes no longer avoiding. "I forgot that human beings have limits." His voice sank low, each word falling slowly, making the room pause for a few seconds. Those words were not an excuse, but the rawest form of admission. He knew he was speaking to the whole country, to millions who once looked at a police badge and felt safe only to see fear in it today. Limits of endurance, those words echoed everywhere. The press recorded it, social media repeated it, and those in that room knew they had just witnessed a moment Maplewood's history would never forget. A woman in the audience began to cry, not out of pity, but because for the first time she had heard a police officer admit that power can blind people too. The chair tapped the gavel lightly, his voice firm. "The committee has reviewed all materials. Based on the evidence, testimony, and preliminary findings, we declare Officers Travis Cole and Brent Hayes are permanently stripped of their badges, and the case is referred to criminal investigation authorities as required by law." The sentence rang out sharp like a clean cut. Light fell across the tiled floor, glinting off the silver badge removed from the uniform, rolling across the table before falling to the ground, a small sound but heavy like the end of an era. The entire room fell silent. Adrienne was not present, but her presence was felt in every glance and every breath of those who witnessed it. Cole stood slowly, buttoned his coat, then turned to Hayes and gave a slight nod, a quiet goodbye. He didn't resist, didn't protest, just walked down on the aisle between the rows of chairs in silence. Cameras followed him, recording the weighted curve of his back, the light taps of his worn black shoes blending with the whir of shutters like a closing note to a chapter of reckoning. Hayes followed, eyes red, stopping at the door to bow slightly toward the committee, a small gesture, but one that left the room still. Someone in the crowd whispered, "Sometimes the fall of one man is the lesson of a generation." Outside the building, hundreds waited. When the doors opened, no one cheered, no one shouted harsh words. They stood quietly, watching the two men walk out in a silence that marked closure. A reporter turned to the camera, voice low. Today Maplewood didn't defeat anyone, but it reclaimed something it had lost trust. And in the distance, as the screen replayed the moment, Cole bowed and left. Evan Brooks watched with an expression not of anger or triumph, but the look of someone witnessing justice begin to turn back onto its rightful path. One late afternoon, faint sunlight fell through the windows of the Maplewood police station, casting a pale gold glow over its worn plaques. Evan Brooks walked in taller than before, his face, marked by storms past, now unusually composed. He came alone, no mother, no media carrion, only civil rights and leadership, the book that had fallen to the ground on that fateful day. The officer on duty looked up hesitant, then nodded. "He's in the last room on the right." Evan nodded back, walked the long hallway, his footsteps echoing steadily on the tile floor. When the door opened, Officer Travis Cole was sitting alone. No uniform, hair, gray and fingers laced on the table. He looked up, eyes meeting Evan's, paused, then gave a small nod. "You came." Evan stood for a moment before pulling out a chair and sitting across from him. He placed the book on the table, voice low but clear. "Why did you do it?" The question was simple, yet held pained curiosity and a wounded trust. Cole looked down at his hands, then answered slowly, "Because I thought power made me safe." His voice was hoarse, tired, each word dragging from a heavy memory. "I believed that being tough, making others afraid, would earn me respect, but I realized power is just a coat, take it off, and we're all the same." Evan watched him, his gaze not angry, not pitying, but that of someone trying to understand. "Did you ever think about the consequences?" he asked. "About the people you hurt?" Cole nodded slightly. "Now I do every night. I hear the screaming in my head, hear my own voice from that recording. It doesn't go away." They sat in silence. Outside, a siren echoed, reminding them the world was still moving, even as time slowed here. Evan opened the book, laying it in front of Cole, his finger pointing to the first page where the words, "Freedom is a responsibility," stood clear. He said softly, "I think you used to know this, but lost it somewhere along the way." Cole looked down at the page, then gave a sad smile. "Maybe I lost more than just a badge." Evan stood, the fading light casting a glow across his face, making his eyes shine. "Now, do you know what it feels like?" he asked. Cole looked up, voice shaking, exposed. Evan nodded. "Then you know how I felt." He turned, walked out, never looking back. In the room, Cole remained seated, one hand resting on the book, and the sunset streamed in, lighting up the silver letters on the cover like a final reminder. He whispered to himself, "I spent a lifetime making others bow their heads. Now I'm learning how to lift mine." The door closed behind Evan, leaving behind a silence that was heavy yet peaceful. That short encounter did not erase the past, but it was enough for two men, one young, one old, to understand that justice is not just verdicts. It is the moment a person dares to face himself. The last light of day filtered through the narrow window, casting its glow on the faces of Evan Brooks and Travis Cole. Two people standing on opposite ends of a mistake that once shook an entire city. Between them sat a cold metal table where civil rights and leadership lay open, its pages slightly curled by the breeze. Evan looked at Cole, his voice low but steady. "How does it feel now?" Cole looked up, eyes dull like someone wakened from a long stupor. He answered softly, "Exposed." The word wasn't loud, but it echoed through the room like metal striking tile. It wasn't a confession, but an acknowledgement that all the layers of power, the cold smiles, the commands, even what was once called professional honor, had been stripped away, leaving only a bare man facing the consequences of his own actions. Evan stared at him for a long moment, the fire in his eyes from days past no longer there. He exhaled gently, gave a small nod, his voice quiet, clear. "Then you know how I felt." The sentence was brief, but it landed like a final verdict. It carried no vengeance, only closure, a circle completed. In the fading light, Cole bowed his head, his eyes settling in Evan's hands, young, steady, neither trembling nor tense. These were the same hands he had once cuffed, now resting before him with a calm that stung. He understood then that Evan's silence wasn't weakness. It was the triumph of humanity over rage. The room was still only the ticking of the clock marking time. Evan stood, pushing the chair back gently, his shadow stretching long across the tiled floor in the day's last light. Cole didn't lift his head, just murmured, "You'll never know how much I regret it." Evan paused at the door, back turned, his voice soft but firm. "Maybe I won't, but you will, and that's enough." The door opened and a breeze swept in with a chill, rustling the pages of the book on the table. In that moment, Cole felt himself suspended between two worlds, one of darkness and mistake, the other of light and truth. Evan stepped outside. The street was quiet, red dusk spilling over the buildings. He didn't feel victorious nor relieved. Only a quiet space opened inside a place where anger had been set down and peace began to take root. He knew forgiveness wasn't forgetting. It was choosing not to let pain lead anymore. Behind him, Cole remained motionless. He stared into nothing, eyes tired, but no longer frantic. In that silence, he clearly saw the image of himself reflected in Evan's eyes earlier, not an accusing look, but one that forced a man to reckon with his own shadow. On the way home, Evan stopped by Maplewood Park. The bench where he once sat reading was still there, slightly worn but clean. He sat down, resting his hand on the old book, eyes lifted toward the sky turning violet. For the first time after everything, he smiled. He hadn't defeated anyone, but he had overcome the fear within himself. In the distance, wind moved through the trees, leaves rustling like whispers from that morning long ago before anything had begun. And somewhere in that sound, perhaps justice was breathing softly, so softly, like the way two people had just stepped out of the dark to rediscover the human in each other. A few months after the hearing, Maplewood Park, the place where it all began, was restored. The chipped paint on the east brick wall was covered with a fresh coat, brighter and warmer. A group of local artists and high school volunteers arrived early, bringing rollers paint and a large sketch placed on the lawn. When the tarp was pulled down, it revealed Evan Brooks sitting on a stone bench holding an open book, eyes calm and focused, just like that morning. Above the mural, bold letters stretched across, "Knowledge is not a crime," a simple phrase, yet heavy with the weight of a city that had once forgotten the value of the obvious. On the day of the unveiling, Maplewood was more crowded than usual. Families brought their children, elderly folks paused with their bikes by the curb, and the media filmed the scene with rare reverence. Adrienne Brooks arrived quietly, not to speak or stand in the center, but behind the crowd, eyes fixed on the wall. She looked at her son's image, rendered in bold brushstrokes, each line carrying the city's memory. A little girl approached, placed a bouquet of sunflowers beneath the phrase, then sat beside her mother and opened a reading book. That simple gesture made many nearby people smile. Beneath the mural, children sat in rows reading aloud pages from Martin Luther King, Maya Angelou, Nelson Mandela. Those who once believed that words could change the world. Wind from Lake Maple swept through carrying the scent of fresh paint, mixing with laughter and the clear voices of children reading. Someone recorded the moment and posted it online with the caption, "Where knowledge is honored instead of feared." Within hours, the clip spread everywhere, offering a new image of Maplewood, not as a city of scandal, but as a symbol of awakening. The media called it the Wall of Renewal, but locals had a simpler name, Evans Wall. Each morning, elderly walkers stopped to read the phrase students took photos, and those who once shouted in anger now stood silent as if quietly apologizing for their own silence. Adrienne stepped closer to the mural, paused for a few seconds, and lightly touched the sun-warmed paint. Her gaze did not rest on her son's image, but on the sky beyond where children were still laughing. Pride, mixed with sorrow, swelled in her chest, the sorrow of someone who knew that justice sometimes comes at the cost of personal pain. When Evan arrived, he walked up to stand beside her, saying nothing. They looked at the words together, sunlight casting their shadows side by side on the brick below. A journalist quietly captured the moment, and the photo became Maplewood's new symbol, not of confrontation but of reconciliation. That afternoon, as the sun dipped low, its final light reflected on the words, "Knowledge is not a crime," making them glow like gold. The wind whispered softly. Pages turned, birds called to their nests. Everything was strangely peaceful. In a place once shrouded by fear and anger, now only children remained reading beneath the shadow of a new wall, a wall that no longer divided but reconnected people to one another. And there, in the fading light, Maplewood had finally learned how to remember without pain. Adrienne stood at the edge of the park where the old trees cast shadows on the lake. From that distance, she could see the newly painted wall, her son, Evan Brooks' face depicted with calm eyes and a book in hand. The laughter of children mingled with the breeze, a gentle and stirring memory. She removed her glasses, sunlight glinting off her eyes, and in that moment a tear slid down her cheek. It came not from pain, but from the feeling of someone who had endured loss and fear and had finally seen something repaired. Adrienne looked at the children reading beneath that wall, something so simple yet once nearly cost her son his youth. Now, that same image had become a symbol of awakening, of courage, and of faith. The wind lifted her hair, leaves rustling in rhythm with her slow breath. Adrienne pressed her lips together, and another tear fell, but a smile had formed. She remembered the first morning after the incident when Evan sat silently in that small room, refusing to go outside. She feared the world would make him close off, but it hadn't. Evan had stepped forward, had faced it all, and it was his steady silence that forced an entire system to look inward. Looking back now, she saw that he had never needed her power to be protected. He only needed to be seen, to be acknowledged, and to be respected. A group of students ran by, raising phones to snap photos of the mural. One boy turned to his friend and said, "We'll go to school where it happened." The words made Adrienne tilt her head slightly, her eyes glistening. She understood these children would grow up in a different city, one where people weren't afraid to ask questions or to stand for what's right. Among the crowd, no one noticed that the woman beneath the tree was the mayor, and she didn't need them to. This moment wasn't about politics, but about a mother seeing her son and her city regain a long-lost trust. The evening light turned the park golden. The lake reflected the wall where the phrase "knowledge is not a crime" stood as a promise to the future. Adrienne took a deep breath, letting the last tear fall, then vanish into a tired smile. She put her glasses back on, turned away, and walked slowly down the leaf-strewn path. Behind her, the sound of children reading aloud merged with the wind and spread across the space. And in their voices, she heard something clearer than ever. Justice doesn't come from grand buildings, but from small people who dare to believe the world can be better. The following fall, Maplewood entered a historic moment few had imagined would come. Inside the city hall, the early morning light streamed through tall glass windows, casting shadows across the city council benches. The council members sat in solemn silence, before them a file marked Evan Brooks Act. In the audience, the public gathered in full many, holding signs that read, "Justice has memory." When the council chair struck the gavel to open the session, the room fell completely completely still. His voice echoed formal and measured. "We meet today to pass legislation requiring that all citizen stops be fully recorded, stored, and made public when necessary. No one, not even those who enforce the law, should stand outside the light of justice." The words brought silence, not applause, but hundreds of eyes turned to the woman in the last row, Mayor Adrienne Brooks. She did not speak, only observed quietly. On the table in front of her, a photo of Evan reading in the park rested among a stack of papers. Each time someone said Evan Brooks Act, her gaze softened. She knew this was more than a law. It was the result of days when a city had to face its own shame. When the vote count was announced, all in favor, the hall erupted in applause. Some wept, some held hands, and Adrienne only smiled faintly. On the large screen behind the podium, the words Evan Brooks Act, passed unanimously, lit up glowing like a promise to the next generation. The news spread nationwide within hours. The press called it the Riverfall effect, an impact that started in Maplewood but spread like a current beyond its banks. Other states began drafting similar bills requiring full documentation of police and citizen interactions. Law schools used the Maplewood case as a model for community-driven justice reform. One major newspaper ran the headline, "A boy with a book changed how a nation sees power." The words were simple, yet they stirred a sense of awakening in many who read them. Meanwhile, in Maplewood, people gathered outside City Hall to celebrate. Amid the cheers, someone played an old speech by Martin Luther King over a loudspeaker blending with Adrienne's voice from last year's press conference. Her words filled the air. "Justice does not come from titles, but from action." That line had become the foundation for the law bearing her son's name. A high school student standing in the crowd asked his friend, "Do you think Evan knows about this?" The friend replied, "Of course, he made it possible for all of us to see the light again." As the ceremony ended, Adrienne stepped out of the building holding a copy of the new law. Evan waited by the gate, his eyes bright but humble. She handed him the document, her voice catching. "You didn't answer them with anger, you answered with truth." Evan looked at her and smiled softly. "You were right. Justice doesn't need to defeat anyone. It only needs to be seen." The two stood still in the middle of the cheering crowd, sunlight washing over them, and in that moment Maplewood was no longer the site of a painful incident, but the beginning of a new chapter where knowledge, trust, and human dignity were written into law so no one could erase them. After the Evan Brooks Act passed, the City Council held a formal ceremony to announce it publicly. Maplewood's City Hall lit up brightly, the national flag waving under the clear autumn sky. Hundreds of citizens gathered outside holding flowers and signs that read, "Knowledge is not a crime." Inside the hall, every seat was filled not only with politicians, police officers, and reporters, but with students, teachers, and everyday people, those who had followed the journey from the start. When the host introduced Evan Brooks, the room seemed to pause. The 17-year-old walked to the podium, slim in frame, but clear-eyed his steps, calm and steady. He carried no prepared speech, only the old book in his hands, the same civil rights and leadership that had started it all. Evan looked around the room, took a long breath, then spoke slowly. "I didn't want to be famous. I just wanted to read in peace." The words made the room fall silent. His voice was not loud but clear, each word dropping like a reminder that behind all great change lies something small. Evan continued, eyes still fixed on the audience. "There were days I was afraid to leave my house, thought people saw me as a criminal. But then I realized if I let them make me afraid, I'd let fear win. I'm not here today to retell the past. I'm here to say that justice isn't far away. It's in how we see each other, treat each other, and teach our kids that knowledge is a right, not a privilege." A moment of silence blanketed the hall. Then applause erupted loud and rolling like waves. One person stood, then the whole room followed hundreds clapping without pause. The applause went on echoing through the space like a collective apology, an apology to Evan, to children once judged for their skin, and to the city that had once stayed quiet in the face of injustice. Many cried, some covered their faces, and others turned to embrace the person beside them. In the front row, a young policewoman bowed her head, a tear sliding down her cheek, then stood tall and saluted the boy at the podium, not out of duty, but out of true respect. Evan bowed his head in return, lips pressing into a slight smile. He added, voice soft but steady, I know people have changed, and that's enough for me to believe we can do better. I don't need a monument or a street named after me. I just want this to be a place where every child can sit and read without fear. The applause rose again, this time warmer, slower, like the steady heartbeat of a shared conscience. Adrienne stood quietly in the back row, tears welling, but her smile unshaken. She looked at her son, not the boy once handcuffed in the park, but a young man standing before hundreds, speaking of justice, with the calm of lived experience and the strength of belief. As Evan stepped down, the applause continued. It echoed down the hallways out into the square where people watched on a giant screen. In the bright light, he descended the steps and walked into his mother's arms, surrounded by unending applause, the sound of a city learning how to say sorry and also how to begin again. One spring afternoon in the small lecture hall at Maplewood Community College, a special class titled Unconscious Bias was held. In the front rows, students, professors, and local residents sat quietly waiting. As the guest speaker, Margaret Lowell, the woman who had sparked the city's upheaval a year earlier, stepped up to the podium. The arrogance was gone, the half-smile that once drew the city's anger no longer on her face. She dressed simply, looked tired, but her eyes were unusually clear. As the whispers faded, Margaret scanned the room, her hands slightly trembling, but her voice was steady. I used to think fear made me right, but fear, it turns out, is the most dangerous kind of power. The room fell silent. No one laughed, no one whispered, they only watched her. The woman who once represented bias now standing to face it. Margaret spoke, her voice even, but laced with remorse. I used to believe that being cautious was good, that suspicion kept me safe, but I was wrong. I didn't realize that what I called safety was built on someone else's pain. She paused, eyes turning to the window where late daylight caught particles of dust in the air. I haven't slept well since that day, she continued, because I listened to the recording, I watched the video, and I saw myself in the woman I once looked down on, the woman who acted out of fear, then justified it with morals. Her voice dropped hoarse. I learned that when we're afraid, it's easy to be cruel without even realizing it. A student raised a hand. Do you regret calling the police that day? Margaret smiled, but it was a bitter smile. I don't just regret it. I'm ashamed. Because I didn't just harm a child. I betrayed my own values. I thought I was someone who knew right from wrong. But that day, I acted like my fear mattered more than someone else's dignity. The lecture hall stayed silent. Her words came slowly, heavily, but no one looked away. In her voice, they didn't hear excuses, but something rarely heard, late but honest recognition. She stepped down from the podium, walked past the first row, and then stopped in front of the chalkboard. With a trembling hand, she wrote, "Fear feeds prejudice." Beneath it, she added a second line, "Understanding ends it." She turned back to the students. "I can't erase what I've done, but I can show you why it must not happen again. Prejudice is an instinct. It's a habit fed by silence." A girl, in the last row, eyes wet, stood up and said softly, "Thank you for coming here and saying that." Margaret nodded, smiling gently. "I didn't come here to be forgiven. I came to remind everyone that sometimes sometimes the one who caused harm also has to relearn how to be human. Applause followed, not loud, but slow wave after wave spreading through the lecture hall. Some students walked up to take her hand, others simply watched in silence. The windows were wide open, the afternoon breeze carried the scent of grass, and the fading light remained warm. As the session ended, people slowly filed out, leaving Margaret alone staring at the words she had just written. Her hand rested on the board, chalk dust sticking to her fingertips, but she didn't wipe it off. On her face, there was no trace of pride, only the calm of someone who had dared to face the darkest part of herself. Outside, the last rays of sunlight slipped behind the rooftops, casting her shadow long across the floor, a shadow of someone who had once angered an entire city, now the first to apologize through action, not word. Margaret Lowell's words echoed through the small hall so raw that all other sound seemed to stop. Fear is the most dangerous kind of power. No one laughed, no one breathed too loudly. Everyone sat still, as if afraid to break the silence that filled the room. The evening light streamed through the windows, landing on faces bowed in reflection, giving the moment a strange solemnity. The silence didn't come from pity nor from sympathy, but from realization. Everyone in the room saw some part of themselves in Margaret's word. Everyone had feared, had judged before, understanding, had once thought their own caution was harmless, and now they saw it wasn't harmless at all. Margaret looked down at the front row where a young student was carefully taking notes. She continued, her voice soft but clear. It's easy to judge others when they do something wrong, but we rarely ask ourselves how many times we've stayed silent when we saw something wrong. I stayed silent with my fear until it turned into action. An older man by the window nodded slightly, his eyes filled with thought. In that space, every word Margaret spoke peeled back another layer of truth, the kind no one wanted to face. A female student stood up, notebook in hand, her voice shaky but firm. You're right. I used to think bias only existed in books, but it's in the way I look at people every day. Margaret smiled and nodded. And the best part is, you saw it before it was too late. The world doesn't need us to be perfect. It needs us to be honest. That reply made a few people lower their eyes, their gazes meeting in a silence tinged with unease, because what they saw wasn't just a story of a woman who made a mistake, but a mirror reflecting the limits they had once allowed themselves. At the back of the room, an older teacher, the one who had organized the session, clasped her hands together and said softly, "Margaret, you have no idea what you just did today." Margaret shook her head gently, her eyes kind but sad. "I just gave back what I once took understanding." That sentence brought the room to silence once more. Outside, the late afternoon sun fell across the hallway light, passing through the window and casting a long glow on the board where the words "Fear feeds prejudice" still remained. As the session ended, students drifted around the room, but no one rushed to leave. They stood in small groups, speaking quietly, sharing what they had just heard. A young man turned to his friend and said, "She didn't speak to be forgiven. She spoke to make us look at ourselves." His friend nodded. "And that's the hardest part." Meanwhile, Margaret remained seated in the back row, eyes fixed on the words on the board, hands folded, her heart lighter after months of silence. When she stepped out of the building, the early evening breeze swept past, carrying the laughter of students still gathered in the courtyard. Margaret paused, looking up at the sky, painted in shades of orange, and realized that sometimes the greatest act of atonement isn't about being forgiven, it's about helping others see themselves through your mistake. And perhaps for the first time in a long year, she felt truly free. In the lulled afternoon, the sky over Maplewood was still. The lake in the old park shimmered with the last light of day, its surface calm like mirror reflecting the pale red sky. On a wooden bench by the water, Adrienne Brooks and Even sat side by side in silence. They hadn't had much time together since the Evan Brooks law was passed. Today, Adrienne had told her assistant to cancel everything, setting aside this afternoon just for her son. The gentle sound of water at the lake's edge, the breeze threading through the willows all created a stillness that made time feel suspended. Adrian looked at her son, her eyes filled with both pride and concern. "I used to think justice was about doing what's right," she said, her voice low. "Now I know it's about standing up when others are wrong." Evan didn't answer. He just looked down at the water where their reflections wavered with the ripples. He spoke slowly. "I used to think justice was about winning, about punishing the ones who did wrong. But now I see it's more like light, not to expose mistakes, but to help people find their way again." Adrian smiled, a rare and warm smile. She nodded, her eyes shining in the sunset. "You've learned something most people spend a lifetime trying to understand." Evan tilted his head slightly, asking quietly, "Do you ever regret not getting to the park earlier that day?" Adrian looked toward the lake where waves had started to spread. "I do, but then I realized if I had arrived earlier, maybe this whole city would never have woken up." She spoke slowly, each word clear, as if wanting to carve something deeper than comfort into her son's memory. A group of ducks passed by, leaving streaks in the water. Evan followed them with his eyes, his hand unconsciously tightening. "I used to be afraid of them," he said softly. "Every time I saw a police car, my heart raced. But now I don't hate them anymore." Adrienne turned toward him, her gaze softening. "That's how justice heals, not through revenge, but by making fear lose its power." Evan gave a quiet nod. "I don't want them gone, I just want them to change. And they will," Adrienne replied, "because your generation won't let things go back to the way they were." She paused, exhaling slowly. "When I was young, I believed power was what helped fix things. But now I know what truly makes the world better is the patience and courage of those without power." The sun slipped behind the trees, leaving a long red trail across the lake. Evan leaned back on the bench and said quietly, "I still remember the day at the police station when you walked in and everyone went silent. I wasn't scared anymore because I knew you wouldn't let me face it alone." Adrienne let out a soft laugh. "I didn't walk in as the mayor. I walked in as a mother. And sometimes that's the strongest title there is." Evan looked at her, his eyes holding a quiet gratitude. "I learned that from you, the courage to step into the place others walk away from in silence." A light breeze passed through, carrying a few dry leaves down to the surface of the lake. Adrienne watched them fall and spoke more softly. "Sometimes I wonder if everything that happened hurt you too much." Evan shook his head. "No, Mom. It gave me a reason to become someone better." That sentence made her squint slightly as if to hold back tears, but then she let them fall. "I'm proud of you," she said, "not because you became a symbol, but because you've kept your kindness." Evan gave a simple smile. "I think I'm just continuing the path you started." On the lake, the last light dissolved into the dark, leaving behind a calm shade of deep purple. The two of them stayed there silent, needing no more word. Everything around them was peaceful in an unusual way, a kind of rare peace Adrienne hadn't felt in the long, pressured days behind her. She quietly thought to herself, maybe real justice doesn't live in laws or power, but in moments like this, when people look at each other without fear. And in that moment, as dusk gently settled in, the voices of two generations merged together, light as the breath of a city learning how to love itself again. Evan leaned slightly, his eyes still on the lake, glowing with fading light. He smiled, soft but deep. "I'm not afraid of them anymore." Adrienne turned to him and looked at her son for a long time. In that moment, she no longer saw the little boy who once trembled under angry voices, but a young man who had moved past fear, steady and calm, the kind of man she had once hoped he would become. She nodded, her voice warm and low. "Me neither." A simple sentence, but it closed the long, heavy chapter of the past year. They sat in silence, letting the breeze roll off the water, cool and clean. In front of them, a group of white ducks swam by, each one tilting its head as it cut through the water, leaving behind soft, round ripples. Evan sat still, watching them, his lips moving slightly as if speaking something quietly inside. After the storm, the lake was still the same lake, but the way people saw it had changed. Just like the city once boiling with outrage, now learning how to breathe again. On the far bank, a small boy tossed bits of bread into the water, his laughter drifting through the breeze. Adrienne and Evan both looked over their eyes, meeting in silence. They didn't need to say anything more because everything important had already been said, and what remained was the peace of two hearts that had endured and healed. Adrienne placed a hand on her son's shoulder, her palm warm as if passing along a breath of gratitude. "When I look at you today," she said quietly, "I see myself years ago when I still believed a single sentence could change the world. But I've learned the world doesn't change because of words, it changes because of people who keep believing even when their words are twisted." Evan smiled, tilting his head toward her. "And you're still that kind of person." Adrienne gave a quiet laugh. "No, now I just want the world to change because of people like you." The sound of gentle waves lapping against the shore echoed like a steady heartbeat. Evan bent down to pick up a small pebble and tossed it far across the lake. The stone skipped across the surface, creating wide circles that spread out before fading. "I remember when I was little, you once told me waves begin from a very small movement," he said, his voice tinged with reflection. "Now, I think we're living in the middle of those ripples. Every action, every word, every glance spreads even when we can't see it." Adrienne gave a small nod, her eyes filled with pride. "And that's exactly why we have to be careful with even the smallest things." The sun was slowly sinking, casting golden light over the trees along the lake. The birds called less and less, the sound of traffic in the distance faded, as if the whole city had paused to rest in this moment. Adrienne leaned back against the bench, eyes closed, her voice lower. "I used to think peace was something people found after the fight was over. But now I understand real peace is when people learn how to live without having to fight at all." Evan gave a soft nod, his gaze reaching far. "Maybe that's what I've learned too. Not every battle needs to be won, some only need to be endured." That sentence made Adrienne open her eyes. She looked at her son with deep pride, as if she were seeing a new generation standing before her, steady, free of resentment, able to understand and preserve their heart through life's challenges. The sun fully disappeared behind the lake, the light turning bronze and reflecting in their eyes. Adrienne slowly stood up, stepping toward the water's edge, her coat stirring in the wind. Evan followed, and together they stood watching the lake darken. She spoke, her voice like a quiet thought. "Maybe we can't change everything, but at the very least we can make sure justice is no longer a luxury." Evan nodded. "You already have." Adrienne turned back to him, her gaze gentle and calm. "No, we have." They returned to the bench, sitting quietly as the ducks drifted farther out. The sky in the west turned pale red tree branches, casting long shadows across the lake as the water deepened in color. Evan spoke softly, "I think I'll leave Maplewood for a while, go to different place, talk to young people, tell them what happened. Not to relive the past, but to show them things can change." Adrienne sat still for a moment, then smiled lightly. "You should go. Each of us carries a piece of light. Take yours where it's needed most." Evan nodded, his eyes focused on the horizon, where water met sky. "I think I'll come back. Maplewood taught me that everything can begin again, even people." The sky had turned a deep purple, and the glow from the streetlights shimmered on the lake like fallen stars. Adrienne looked over at her son, her gaze peaceful, while Evan tilted his head back, letting the night breeze run through his hair. In that quiet scene, the two of them watched the ducks glide by pair, moving gently across the water. That simple, quiet image brought a close to a storm-filled chapter where fear had dissolved and only resilience and forgiveness remained. In that soft twilight, they understood that peace was not what follows justice, but the shape justice takes when people learn how to live together without causing more harm. 1 year later, Sprinks returned to Maplewood, a small city once caught in a storm, now wearing an unfamiliar calm. That morning, people gathered at the Central Park where the grass had grown green again, and the mural of Evan Brooks still stood bright against the sky. The day was named Dignity Day, a day for remembrance, dialogue, and action in honor of human respect. The atmosphere in the park was both solemn and warm. Children ran around adults, chatted, and students carried small flags that read, "Respect lives here." On the old stone bench where the confrontation that shook the nation once occurred, a polished bronze plaque had been placed engraved with the words, "Here sat a boy who made grown men learn." The simple yet profound sentence remained like an unerasable mark in the memory of the city. The ceremony began with the distant chime of church bells blending into the voices of a student choir singing Amazing Grace. Hundreds stood in silence, some with bowed heads, some with faint smiles. On a small stage in front of the painted wall, Mayor Adrienne Brooks stepped forward, her posture still firm, though her gaze was gentler than before. She looked at the crowd, the morning light reflecting off her glasses and lighting up her face. 1 year ago, she said slowly, this city witnessed something terrible, but from it, we found something deeply good. Today, we are not here to remember pain, but to remind each other that dignity cannot be taken by skin color, profession, or fear. Her voice paused briefly, then rang out clearer. We are here to say we've learned. In the crowd below, Evan sat among the rows of seats, now looking more mature, his expression calm. When his mother finished, he was invited to speak. He walked slowly, his shoes making soft, steady sounds against the wooden floor. The air felt like it was holding its breath. 1 year ago, Evan began, people feared each other simply because they didn't understand each other. But today, I see something different. I see people who once stayed silent, standing together, people who once doubted, now learning to listen. He paused, his eyes resting on the bronze plaque shining in the sun. I don't want to be remembered as a symbol. I just want people to remember that sometimes a small act like sitting and reading a book in the park can make an entire city see things differently. His words brought a hush over the crowd, followed by waves of applause rolling across the park. In the front row, a group of elementary school students opened their books in unison and began reading aloud a few lines from I Have a Dream. Their young voices, unsteady but full of life, rose into the breeze, bringing tears to many eyes. A journalist captured the scene, and through the camera lens, the image of the young boy from a year ago, now standing among the crowd, came into view, his hand gently touching the words, "Here sat a boy who made grown men learn," his eyes bright and composed. As the ceremony ended, people stepped forward one by one to place flowers beneath the bronze plaque. A thin, middle-aged man in an old police uniform approached and removed his hat in salute. It was Brent Hayes, the officer who once stood beside Cole. He bowed deeply, said nothing, and left behind a silver badge at the base of the plaque before walking away in silence. The sight moved many to tears, but from a distance, Adrienne only offered a faint smile. To her, it was proof that justice doesn't end in court. It begins in the moment someone dares to acknowledge the part of themselves that was wrong. As the afternoon settled in, the sunlight glittered across the lake, casting gold over the park. Children still ran around the mural. Adults took photos while Adrienne and Evan remained seated on the bench where everything began. She said quietly, "I don't know if people will remember this day in the years to come, but at the very least you've left them something they won't forget." Evan tilted his head and replied softly, "Not me, Mom. All the people who spoke up." Adrienne nodded her eyes, looking off into the distance. "Then we did the right thing." Across the lake, the church bells rang once more, soft like a greeting from a new year from a city that had been reborn. The crowd began to scatter, but the light remained on the bronze plaque, reflecting a long streak like a mark of color across the history of Maplewood. In the breeze, the words, "Here sat a boy who made grown men learn," seemed to echo inside everyone's heart, a quiet reminder that dignity does not need to be earned, only recognized. Adrienne Brooks stepped onto the wooden platform at the center of the park, hundreds of eyes turning toward her. The morning light streamed through the trees, casting warm gold across her hair and reflecting on the silent faces below. She held no notes, no advisors stood beside her. In front of her were the people of Maplewood, those who had lived through a year of upheaval, who had witnessed fear, division, and awakening. She looked at them for a long time, her eyes carrying the calm of someone who had lost enough to know that words only matter when they come from the heart. "I don't need them to remember my title," she said, her voice steady across the open air. "Remember the boy with the book?" A wave of silence moved through the crowd. Her words were brief, but their echo stilled the gathering for several seconds, as if each person had turned inward. Adrienne lifted her gaze toward the stone bench where Evan once sat, now a symbol. The sunlight hit the bronze plaque, making the engraved words, "Here sat a boy who made grown men learn," glow like fire. She continued, her voice even but charged with emotion. That boy didn't want to be famous, didn't seek attention. He just wanted to sit quietly and read a book. And yet, from that moment, an entire city had to ask itself, what have we become when we need the police to confront a child reading in a park? A quiet sob broke somewhere in the crowd, then faded into the soft breeze. Adrienne took a deep breath and stepped down from the platform, moving closer to the crowd, her voice warm and steady. "We cannot change the past, but we can choose how we tell it. And if today means anything, it's to remind each other that every person deserves to be treated with respect, even in silence." She paused, her eyes landing on a group of elementary students holding books. "If someone asked me what I'm most proud of," she said, "I wouldn't mention projects or positions. I would say today, the day we saw our children stand tall and read in the middle of a park without fear, without hesitation, simply living as they were meant to." Scattered applause began to rise, then quickly swelled into a loud, resounding wave across the space. Those who had once cried a year ago now stood side by side, clapping for a change they had helped shape. Many couldn't hold back their tears. Someone held up a sign that read, "Dignity belongs to everyone." An elderly white woman in the front row nodded slowly, her eyes wet, whispering, "She's right." No one else spoke. There was only the sound of clapping merging with the wind, and birds overhead creating a sound both powerful and peaceful, a sound Maplewood had never heard before. Adrienne stepped back a few paces and stood beside her son. Evan looked at her, his face, calm pride, quietly shining in his eyes. The two of them stood together, saying nothing more. The image moved several journalists to lower their cameras, choosing to simply witness instead of record. They understood that some moments carry a truth too strong for film to capture. The sky above was unusually clear, and a few birds crossing overhead reflected on the still surface of the lake. When the final applause faded, Adrienne turned to take in the full view of the park, the place where everything had begun. She spoke just loud enough for Evan to hear. "This city has learned something I've always believed, that justice cannot exist if people don't care for one another." Evan smiled. And I think they won't forget." Adrienne placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, her gaze kind but firm. "If they do, remind them by the way you live." He nodded, his eyes fixed on the stone bench where the light was growing stronger, as if the sun itself wanted to remain there a little longer. As the ceremony came to a close, people slowly made their way along the winding paths around the lake. Children played, adults chatted, and a few elderly people sat near the bronze plaque, silently reading its engraved words. Adrienne and Evan stayed behind. She looked up at the sky where the white clouds were slowly dissolving and the brilliant light poured down, covering the entire park. In that moment, time seemed to pause. The breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass, and everything felt strangely pure. Evan looked around and saw faces of every color and age blending together without division. And in that instant, he understood that Dignity Day wasn't meant to commemorate a boy or a mistake, but to remind everyone that human dignity never dies, it only waits to be called by its name again. Morning light poured down, catching the dew still clinging to the grass, making the park seem to glow from within. At the center stood the bronze plaque, gleaming under the sun, surrounded by by fresh white flowers. The scene marked the close of a long journey from darkness to light, from fear to empathy, and in the whispering wind it was as if someone softly said, "That boy sat here, and we learned how to be human." As the last of the morning light from Dignity Day faded through the trees of Maplewood Park, the small city sank into a sense of calm few had believed possible. 1 year had passed since the sound of police sirens echoed, since the image of a black teenager in handcuffs shocked the nation. From a peaceful morning to a moment of chaos, from a biased phone call by Margaret Lowell to the powerful arrival of Mayor Adrian Brooks, that story not only changed the life of a boy named Evan, it rewrote how an entire city viewed justice. Evan that day was just a teenager reading in the park who accidentally became a symbol of courage after being treated like a criminal. His silence, the calm in his eyes while being handcuffed, and his final words to the officer, "You're proving exactly what this book says," made the world stop. He didn't shout, didn't resist, but that quiet composure forced society to see itself in the mirror he unintentionally held up. The story was no longer about one person, but a testament to how prejudice can distort an entire system. Adrienne Brooks, upon seeing her son humiliated, did not respond with anger, but with the reason of a leader. She didn't demand privilege, she demanded accountability. When she walked into the police station, her gaze did not just shake the guilty, it made society ask itself if that boy wasn't the mayor's son who would have stood up for him. Her question, "And if it were someone else's child, what would change?" became a line that struck the conscience harder than any political speech. In that moment, people understood that justice is not the privilege of the powerful, but the basic right of every human being. And from there, silence began to break voices. Rose, witnesses stepped forward, and ordinary people started to realize they could no longer stay quiet. Evan's story did not end with revenge. It ended with awakening. The fact that 2 police officers were stripped of their badges and placed under criminal investigation was not a victory for one family. It was the first step toward reform. When the Evan Brooks law was passed requiring all citizen stops to be recorded, it wasn't just a law. It was a declaration by a new generation, a generation that believes justice must be transparent, must be seen, must be witnessed. Maplewood, once labeled a segregated city, had become a symbol of change. From the mural of Evan reading to the plaque that read, "Here sat a boy who made grown men learn," every piece served as a reminder that courage doesn't require violence, and kindness is not always easy, but it's always worth it. As for Margaret Lowell, the woman who once called 911 in a moment of fear, she later stood before a classroom to speak about unconscious bias. She didn't justify, she didn't seek to redeem herself. She simply said one sentence that made the entire room go silent. Fear is the most dangerous kind of power because it makes us think we're protecting ourselves when we're really destroying someone else. That line didn't come from a hero, but from someone who knew regret. And maybe that quiet admission, small but sincere, was what made Evan's story feel complete. In the end, when Adrian and Evan sat again by the old lake, they didn't talk about past wounds, but about what lay ahead. They understood that justice is not handed down from above, but built from within each person. She once said, "True peace isn't when people stop fighting, it's when they learn how to live together without causing harm." That sentence was later carved into a small stone pillar in Maplewood, a message to the future. Dignity Day, a day not to remember pain, but to honor worth. On that day, people of every color stood side by side, reading aloud lines from Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream." Children read with innocent voices, adults listened with hearts that had been hurt, and the elderly teared up because they saw that the dream, though late, was still growing. Evan, standing among the crowd, smiled softly when he saw his mother in the morning light. He was no longer the boy from Maplewood Park, but a symbol of a new generation, a generation unafraid to speak, unafraid to think, and brave enough to stand still in the face of violence so the world would be forced to stop. The story of Evan Brooks was not about a wrongful arrest. It was the journey of a person reclaiming the value of human dignity. It taught that justice does not come from power, but from the courage to ask questions. It reminded us that silence can sometimes echo louder than shouting, and that every small action, every seemingly meaningless word can become a spark in the dark. Maplewood has changed, but its lesson remains that every child is born with the right to hold their head high. Every person deserves respect, and the world will only know peace when we stop seeing one another through prejudice and start seeing one another with our hearts.